The train pulled into Red Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a bride who would never meet her groom. Samuel Archer lay dead in the town cemetery, shot through the heart 2 days before his wedding day. Lydia Hartwell stood on that dusty platform with everything she owned in one suitcase and a marriage contract that meant nothing anymore. She was 3,000 miles from home, stranded in a frontier town where women alone didn't last long. What happened next would change her life forever. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The November wind cut across the Colorado prairie like a knife through silk, sharp and unforgiving. Lydia Hartwell felt it pierce straight through her wool traveling coat as she stepped down from the Union Pacific rail car onto the wooden platform of Red Hollow Station. The altitude made her lightheaded, or perhaps it was fear finally catching up with exhaustion. She had been traveling for 8 days straight, watching civilization gradually thin and disappear through the train window until there was nothing left but endless brown grass and distant mountains that looked like broken teeth against the sky. She set her leather suitcase down and smoothed her skirts with trembling hands. The dress was her finest, deep blue velvet with pearl buttons she'd sewn herself during the long nights before leaving Philadelphia. She'd imagined Samuel Archer seeing her in it for the first time, had pictured his face lighting up with recognition and maybe something warmer. They'd exchanged photographs 6 months ago, stiff formal portraits that revealed little except that he was broad-shouldered and serious-looking, and she was young with what her mother called determined eyes. The platform was nearly empty. A handful of passengers shuffled past her toward the small station house. Rough-looking men in dusty clothes, a woman with 2 small children clinging to her skirts, an old man carrying a wooden crate that smelled of livestock. None of them gave Lydia more than a passing glance. She stood there clutching her traveling bag, scanning the sparse crowd for a tall man in a rancher's hat who would be looking for a bride from the east. But no one approached. The conductor called out behind her, something about baggage and departure times, and then the train began to move, its wheels screeching against the rails, steam hissing into the cold air. Lydia watched it pull away with a sudden spike of panic. That train was her last connection to everything familiar, and now it was disappearing around a distant bend, leaving her alone in a place that felt as foreign as the surface of the moon. "Miss? You waiting for someone?" The voice belonged to a weathered man in a station master's uniform, his face deeply lined and his eyes kind but curious. He stood in the doorway of the station house, one hand on the frame. "Yes," Lydia said, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm here to meet Mr. Samuel Archer. He should have received a telegram about my arrival." Something shifted in the man's expression. The kindness remained, but it was joined by something else. Pity, perhaps, or discomfort. "You'd better come inside, miss," he said quietly. The station house was warmer, but not by much. A pot-bellied stove radiated weak heat in one corner, and a few wooden benches lined the walls. The station master gestured for Lydia to sit, but she remained standing, her hands gripping the handle of her suitcase so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "There's no easy way to say this," the man began, removing his cap and turning it in his hands. "Samuel Archer passed away 2 days ago, Sunday evening. There was a dispute, a bad one, over water rights up at Crane Creek. Things got heated and—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Sam was a good man. Didn't deserve what happened." The words reached Lydia's ears, but her mind couldn't quite process them. Passed away. The phrase sounded so gentle, so civilized, completely at odds with the violent reality he was describing. "He's dead?" She heard her own voice as if from a great distance. "Yes, miss. I'm real sorry. The funeral was yesterday morning." Lydia sat down then, not because she chose to, but because her legs simply gave out. The bench was hard beneath her, the room too warm suddenly, despite the cold draft that snaked through the gaps in the walls. She stared at a knot in the wooden floorboards and tried to understand what this meant. Samuel Archer was dead. The man she'd traveled 3,000 miles to marry, the man whose letters had promised her a new life, a fresh start, a chance to escape the suffocating expectations of Philadelphia society, was lying in the ground. She had sold everything. The small inheritance from her grandmother, the few pieces of jewelry that had any value, even her mother's writing desk that she'd loved since childhood. She'd used the money to pay for the train passage and to purchase the basic supplies Samuel had suggested in his letters: practical clothes suitable for ranch life, sturdy boots, a good coat. She'd left behind a city where her prospects were dim, a spinster daughter of a deceased minister, with no connections and no money, destined for a life of dependence on increasingly distant relatives. And now she was here, in Red Hollow, Colorado. A town that consisted of one main street, a handful of wooden buildings, and a population that probably numbered less than 200 souls. She was here with $12 remaining in her purse, no return ticket, and nowhere to go. "Is there family?" the station master asked gently. "Someone back east who could wire you money for passage home?" Lydia almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat and came out as something closer to a sob. Home. The word had no meaning anymore. Her parents were both dead. Her older brother Thomas had made it clear that his wife didn't want a spinster sister living with them indefinitely. Her aunt in Baltimore had been kind but firm. There was no room, no money, no future there for Lydia. "No," she said quietly. "There's no one." The station master shifted his weight uncomfortably. "There's a boarding house in town. Mrs. Fletcher runs it. It's not fancy, but it's clean and respectable. $1 a week for room and board. $12. 12 weeks if she didn't eat, didn't need anything, didn't move. And then what?" "I'll need to find work," Lydia said, more to herself than to him. He looked even more uncomfortable. "Miss, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but work for women in Red Hollow is limited. There's the boarding house, the laundry, and—" he paused delicately. "Other establishments that I don't reckon you'd be interested in." Lydia understood perfectly. A woman alone in a frontier town had few options, and most of them were dangerous. She could feel the walls closing in, the future narrowing to a pinpoint of light that was rapidly fading to black. "Thank you for your honesty," she managed to say. "If you could point me toward Mrs. Fletcher's establishment, I'd be grateful." He gave her directions. 3 blocks down Main Street, turn left at the blacksmith shop, white house with green shutters. Simple enough. She picked up her suitcase and turned toward the door, trying to summon some reserve of strength or courage or simple stubbornness that would get her through the next few hours. "Miss?" the station master called after her. "What's your name?" "Lydia Hartwell." He nodded slowly. "I'll let folks know you're here, Miss Hartwell, in case anyone knew Sam and might want to help." It was a kind gesture, though Lydia suspected it would amount to nothing. She'd read enough about the frontier to know that charity was scarce in places where survival itself was a daily battle. Still, she thanked him and stepped back out into the cold. The sun was lower now, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Lydia walked down the platform steps and onto the dirt street, her suitcase growing heavier with each step. The town of Red Hollow spread before her, a collection of wooden buildings that looked temporary, as if a strong wind might blow the whole place away. She could see a general store, a saloon with several horses tied outside, what appeared to be a land office, a barber shop, and at the end of the street a small, whitewashed church with a modest steeple. People moved along the wooden sidewalks, men mostly, with a scattering of women in practical dresses and bonnets. A few glanced at her with open curiosity. A stranger was probably a notable event in a place this small. Lydia walked slowly, trying to get her bearings, trying not to let the panic completely overwhelm her. She passed the general store and glanced through the window at shelves stocked with goods: flour, sugar, canned foods, rope, tools, all the practical necessities of frontier life. A man inside was weighing something on a scale while a customer waited. "You lost, miss?" The voice startled her. She turned to find a young woman standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a dressmaker's shop. She was perhaps a few years older than Lydia, with red hair pinned up under a simple bonnet and an appraising look in her green eyes. "I'm looking for Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house," Lydia said. "You just passed it. Back there, the white house with green shutters." The woman tilted her head. "You're the bride, aren't you? The one Samuel Archer was expecting." Word traveled fast in small towns. Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry. That was a bad business up at Crane Creek. Sam was well liked around here. She paused. I'm Margaret Hayes. I run this shop. Lydia Hartwell. You planning to stay in Red Hollow, Miss Hartwell? It was a simple question, but it carried weight. Lydia could hear the unspoken inquiry. What's a city woman going to do here now that her prospects are dead and buried? I haven't decided yet, Lydia said carefully. Margaret nodded as if that was answer enough. Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me. She disappeared back into her shop before Lydia could respond. Lydia retraced her steps to the boarding house. It was exactly as described, white clapboard with green shutters, a small porch with 2 rocking chairs, and a hand-painted sign that read, Fletcher House, clean rooms, reasonable rates. She climbed the steps and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was tall and angular, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that took in Lydia's appearance in one sweeping glance. The velvet dress, the expensive suitcase, the obvious marks of Eastern refinement and current desperation. Mrs. Fletcher? Lydia asked. That's right. The station master suggested I speak with you about lodging. My name is Lydia Hartwell. I know who you are, Mrs. Fletcher interrupted. The bride Samuel Archer sent for. Whole town knows by now. She stepped back from the door. Come in. No sense standing in the cold. The interior of the boarding house was neat and spare. Lydia could see a parlor to the left with simple furniture and a dining room to the right with a long table set for supper. The smell of cooking meat and potatoes drifted from somewhere in the back. Room's $1 a week, meals included, Mrs. Fletcher said without preamble. Payment in advance. House rules are simple. No drinking, no men in your room, no noise after 9 o'clock. Church on Sundays is expected but not required. Laundry is extra. I understand, Lydia said. She set down her suitcase and opened her small purse, counting out one of her precious dollars. Mrs. Fletcher took it and tucked it into her apron pocket. You're in room 3, top of the stairs. Supper's at 6. Don't be late. But she turned to leave, then paused. I'll be honest with you, Miss Hartwell. Red Hollow's not Philadelphia. Life here is hard, and it's harder for women alone. If you're smart, you'll use whatever money you have left to buy a ticket back east before winter really sets in. She walked away before Lydia could respond, leaving her standing in the hallway with her suitcase and the weight of that advice pressing down on her chest. Room 3 was small but clean, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a single wooden chair, and a small window that looked out over the street. Lydia set her suitcase on the bed and sat down beside it, finally allowing herself to feel the full force of everything that had happened. She had been so careful. She'd corresponded with Samuel Archer for nearly 4 months before agreeing to come west. His letters had been brief but sincere, describing his ranch and his life with an honesty that had touched her. He hadn't made false promises or painted an unrealistic picture. He told her the work would be hard, that the land was unforgiving, that she would need strength and resilience. But he'd also written about the beauty of the mountains, the satisfaction of building something from nothing, and the possibility of a partnership based on mutual respect rather than romantic illusions. She'd believed him. More than that, she'd believed in the possibility of starting over, of becoming someone new in a place where her past didn't matter and her future was still unwritten, and now that future had died before it even began. Lydia lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, watching the fading light paint shadows across the rough wooden planks. She thought about her mother, who had died when Lydia was 16, and whose last words had been about the importance of courage. She thought about her father, the minister who had preached about faith and perseverance even as his own health failed. She thought about all the paths that had led her to this moment, to this small room in a frontier town where she knew no one and had nothing. The tears came then, hot and bitter, and she let them fall. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, someone was knocking firmly on her door. Miss Hartwell, supper's on the table. Lydia sat up, disoriented. The room was darker now, the last light of day nearly gone. She quickly washed her face in the basin, tidied her hair, and made her way downstairs. The dining room held 6 other boarders, all men, ranging in age from a young clerk who couldn't have been more than 18 to a grizzled prospector who looked ancient. They stood when she entered, a gesture of frontier courtesy that surprised her, and Mrs. Fletcher pointed to an empty chair near the end of the table. Gentlemen, this is Miss Lydia Hartwell from Philadelphia. Miss Hartwell, these are your fellow boarders. There were murmured greetings, polite nods. Lydia took her seat as Mrs. Fletcher brought out platters of food: roast beef, boiled potatoes, carrots, and thick slices of bread. It was simple fare, but after days of eating cold sandwiches and fruit on the train, it looked like a feast. They ate in relative silence, the kind that spoke of men accustomed to their own company and not much interested in conversation. But Lydia could feel their curiosity, the occasional glances in her direction, the unspoken questions about what she was doing here and how long she planned to stay. It was the young clerk who finally broke the silence. "Begging your pardon, Miss Hartwell, but are you the lady who was coming to marry Sam Archer?" All eyes turned to her. Lydia set down her fork carefully. "Yes," she said quietly. "I am." "That's a hard piece of luck," the old prospector said, shaking his head. "Sam was good people. Didn't deserve what Jake Mooney did to him." "Jake Mooney?" Lydia repeated. "Owns the ranch north of Sam's place," one of the other men explained. "There's been a dispute over water rights for near about 2 years now. Crane Creek runs through both properties, but the way the land lays, Jake's ranch is upstream. He's been damming the creek, cutting off Sam's water supply during the dry months. They've been fighting about it in the courts," another man added, "but Jake's got money and connections. The case wasn't going Sam's way." "So he shot him?" Lydia couldn't keep the shock from her voice. "It was a confrontation," the clerk said carefully. "Both men were armed. Jake claims self-defense. Says Sam drew first." "Did he?" Lydia asked. The men exchanged glances. Finally, the prospector spoke. "Sam wasn't the kind to draw on a man without cause. But nobody saw exactly what happened except Jake and his foreman, and they tell the same story. Sheriff couldn't prove otherwise, so Jake walked free." Lydia felt a cold rage building in her chest. Samuel Archer, a man she'd never met but whose letters had given her hope, had been killed over water. And his murderer was walking free. "That's not justice," she said quietly. "No, miss," the prospector agreed, "but it's frontier law. Sometimes justice and the law are two different things." The rest of the meal passed in silence. When it was over, Lydia helped Mrs. Fletcher clear the table, an offer that seemed to surprise the older woman, but which she accepted without comment. "You don't have to do that," Mrs. Fletcher said as they carried dishes to the kitchen. "I want to help," Lydia replied. "I'm not accustomed to sitting idle." Mrs. Fletcher gave her an appraising look. "You might do all right here after all," she said, which was possibly the closest thing to approval Lydia was going to get. After the dishes were washed and put away, Lydia returned to her room. She lit the small oil lamp on the washstand and opened her suitcase, unpacking the few belongings she'd brought with her. Among them was a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, all the correspondence from Samuel Archer. She untied the ribbon and read through them again, searching for something she wasn't even sure she could name. The letters revealed a man who was thoughtful and honest, someone who worked hard and valued integrity. He wrote about the challenges of ranch life, about the beauty of the land despite its harshness, about his hope of building something that would last. In his last letter, written 3 weeks before his death, he told her he was looking forward to meeting her, that he hoped they could build a good life together, even if it wouldn't always be an easy one. She carefully folded the letters and placed them at the bottom of her suitcase. Then she changed into her nightgown, extinguished the lamp, and climbed into bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed magnified. The creak of footsteps on the stairs, the distant sound of music and laughter from the saloon down the street, the wind rattling the window frame. She thought about Philadelphia, about the narrow house on Chestnut Street where she'd grown up, about the familiar routines of a life that had felt stifling, but at least predictable. And she thought about tomorrow, about the impossible task of figuring out what came next. Morning came cold and bright. Lydia woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen. She dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses, a gray wool that was warm and practical, and pinned up her hair in a no-nonsense style. Breakfast was a quieter affair than supper. The boarders ate quickly and dispersed to their various occupations. Mrs. Fletcher set a plate in front of Lydia, eggs, bacon, toast, and strong black coffee. "Thank you," Lydia said. Mrs. Fletcher nodded. "What are your plans for the day?" It was a reasonable question, though Lydia didn't have a good answer. I thought I might walk around town, get my bearings. Might want to stop by the land office, Mrs. Fletcher suggested. Sam's property needs to be settled. If you were coming here as his bride, you might have some claim to it. Hope flickered briefly in Lydia's chest, then died just as quickly. We weren't married. I have no legal claim to anything. Maybe not, Mrs. Fletcher said, but it wouldn't hurt to ask. Never know what might be possible. After breakfast, Lydia put on her coat and hat and ventured out into Red Hollow. The morning was crisp and clear, the sky a deep blue that seemed to stretch forever. The street was busier now, horses and wagons moving back and forth, people going about their business with the purposeful efficiency of those who had no time to waste. She found the land office easily enough, a small building with a sign that read, Red Hollow Land and Mining Claims, Edgar Pritchard, Agent. She pushed open the door to find a cramped office filled with filing cabinets, maps on the walls, and a harried-looking man behind a desk covered in papers. He looked up as she entered. Help you? My name is Lydia Hartwell. I was coming to Red Hollow to marry Samuel Archer. I understand his property needs to be settled, and I wanted to know if I might have any claim to it. Edgar Pritchard leaned back in his chair and regarded her with a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. You're not married to him. No. Related to him in any way? No. Then I'm afraid you don't have any claim at all. Sam died intestate, no will. His nearest living relative is a cousin in Kansas, and the property will likely go to him. Lydia had expected as much, but hearing it stated so bluntly still stung. I see. Thank you for your time. She was turning to leave when Pritchard spoke again. Hold on a minute. You said you were coming here to marry Sam? Yes. You have any proof of that? Letters, a contract, anything in writing? Lydia hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the marriage contract Samuel had sent her, a simple document outlining the terms of their agreement. Pritchard read it carefully, his expression thoughtful. This isn't a legal marriage, but it does show intent. And it shows that Sam was making arrangements for your arrival. He looked up at her. I can't give you his property, Miss Hartwell, but I can file a claim on your behalf for compensation, essentially arguing that Sam's death left you stranded here under false pretenses. It's a long shot, and it would take months to work through the courts, but you might be entitled to something. How much? Hard to say. Maybe enough for train fare back east. Maybe a little more. It was better than nothing, though not by much. What would I need to do? Fill out some paperwork, pay a filing fee, $2. Then wait. Lydia thought about her dwindling funds. $2 was a significant amount, but if there was even a chance of getting some compensation, it might be worth the gamble. I'll do it, she said. The paperwork took the better part of an hour. When it was finished, Lydia was $2 poorer, but had at least taken some action, however small. She thanked Pritchard and stepped back out into the street. She spent the rest of the morning exploring Red Hollow. It didn't take long. The town was even smaller than she'd initially thought. Besides the buildings she'd already seen, there was a small bank, a telegraph office, a doctor's office that also served as the dentist's, and a schoolhouse that looked abandoned. She stopped by Margaret Hayes's dress shop and found the proprietor working on what appeared to be a wedding dress. Back again? Margaret said, looking up from her sewing. I was wondering if you might need any help, Lydia said. I'm a good seamstress. I could do alterations, mending, anything you need. Margaret set down her needle and regarded Lydia thoughtfully. I could use the help, truth be told, but I can't pay much. Maybe 50 cents a day, and only when there's work. 50 cents a day wouldn't be enough to live on, but it was something. I'll take it. Can you start now? I've got a pile of mending that needs doing before the end of the week. Lydia removed her coat and hat and settled into a chair by the window. Margaret brought her a basket full of clothes that needed repairs. Torn seams, missing buttons, worn hems. Simple work, but necessary. They worked in companionable silence for a while before Margaret spoke. You're not planning to go back east, are you? Lydia looked up from the shirt she was mending. I don't have anywhere to go back to. Margaret nodded slowly. Then you're going to need to be smart about how you survive here. Red Hollow's not kind to women alone, but it's not impossible either. You need to make yourself useful, indispensable, if you can manage it. That's what I'm trying to do, Lydia said. Good. Margaret returned to her sewing. Just watch yourself. There are men in this town who'll see a woman like you as an opportunity. Not all of them have good intentions. It was a warning Lydia had already figured out for herself, but she appreciated the directness of it. At least Margaret was being honest with her. She worked at the dress shop until late afternoon, earning $1 for her efforts. Margaret paid her in coins that Lydia tucked carefully into her purse before heading back to the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher was in the kitchen preparing supper when Lydia arrived. "Have a productive day?" the older woman asked. "I found some work at the dress shop," Lydia replied. "It's not much, but it's a start." Mrs. Fletcher nodded approvingly. "That's smart. Margaret's tough but fair. You could do worse." Lydia helped with the supper preparations again, and this time Mrs. Fletcher accepted the assistance without comment, as if it was simply expected now. It was a small shift, but Lydia recognized it for what it was: acceptance, however grudging. That evening, after supper, Lydia sat in her room and did the calculations. Even with the work at the dress shop, she was barely making enough to cover her room and board. She needed to find additional income, but the options were limited. She could take in laundry, but that was backbreaking work for minimal pay. She could offer to tutor children, but she didn't know if there was any demand for that in Red Hollow. She was still pondering her options when she heard raised voices from the street below. She went to the window and looked out to see a commotion outside the saloon, 2 men arguing, a crowd gathering. She couldn't make out the words, but the anger in their voices was unmistakable. Then she saw him. A tall man with dark hair and a quiet, watchful demeanor was standing slightly apart from the crowd. He wasn't participating in the argument, but he was paying attention, his hand resting on the gun at his hip in a way that suggested he knew how to use it. There was something about his stillness that drew her eye, a quality of controlled strength, of power held in reserve. As if sensing her gaze, the man looked up at her window. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of acknowledgement and turned back to whatever was happening in the street. Lydia stepped back from the window, her heart beating a little faster than it should. She didn't know who that man was, but something about him had made an impression. She would learn his name soon enough. His name was Gavin Rourke, and he owned a ranch 15 miles outside of town. And within 48 hours, he would make her an offer that would change everything. But that night, Lydia went to bed not knowing what the future held, knowing only that she had survived another day in Red Hollow. And for now, that was enough. 2 days passed before Lydia saw the dark-haired man again. She fell into a routine that felt both foreign and strangely necessary, waking before dawn, helping Mrs. Fletcher with breakfast, spending her days at Margaret's dress shop mending and sewing, then returning to the boarding house for supper, and another night in that small room where the wind rattled the windows and kept her awake. The work at the dress shop was steady but unpredictable. Some days Margaret had enough mending to keep Lydia busy for hours. Other days there was nothing, and Lydia would return to the boarding house with empty pockets and growing anxiety about how long her money would last. She'd started keeping a careful ledger in a small notebook, tracking every penny she earned and spent. The numbers told a harsh story. Even working every day that Margaret had tasks for her, Lydia was barely breaking even. And winter was coming. She could feel it in the air, see it in the way the mountains to the west were beginning to wear caps of snow. On the 3rd morning, she was walking to the dress shop when she heard her name called from across the street. "Miss Hartwell!" She turned to see Edgar Pritchard, the land agent, hurrying toward her with a purposeful stride. He was carrying a leather satchel and looked more animated than he had during their previous meeting. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, "is there news about my claim?" "Not exactly," he said, slightly out of breath. "But there's a development you should know about. Sam Archer's ranch is being auctioned off next week. The cousin in Kansas doesn't want it, says he's got no interest in ranching and just wants whatever cash he can get from the sale." Lydia's heart sank. The ranch that was supposed to have been her new home would now go to someone else entirely. "I see. Here's the thing," Pritchard continued. "The auction's going to be competitive. Jake Mooney's already making noise about buying it, says he wants to consolidate his water rights. But there's another rancher who might bid against him. Name's Gavin Rourke. Owns the property south of Sam's place." That name, the man from the street. Lydia kept her expression neutral. "Why are you telling me this?" Because Rourke came to see me yesterday. Asked questions about you. Wanted to know if you were staying in Red Hollow, what your situation was. Pritchard shifted his satchel to his other hand. I didn't tell him much. Figured that was your business. But I thought you should know someone's asking. A chill ran down Lydia's spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Did he say why he wanted to know? No, ma'am. But Gavin Rourke's not the kind of man who asks idle questions. If he's interested in your situation, there's a reason for it. Pritchard tipped his hat. Just thought you should be aware. Good day, Miss Hartwell. He walked off, leaving Lydia standing on the sidewalk with her thoughts spinning. Why would a stranger be asking about her? And more importantly, what did he want? She didn't have to wait long for answers. That afternoon, as she was finishing a particularly difficult alteration on a dress bodice, the door to Margaret's shop opened and a man walked in. Lydia looked up from her work and found herself face to face with Gavin Rourke. Up close, he was even more striking than he'd appeared from her window. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of slate. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that suggested he was somewhere in his early 30s. He wore working clothes, denim pants, a flannel shirt, a leather vest, and carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and not particularly caring what others thought about it. Afternoon, Gavin, Margaret said, setting down her sewing. What brings you to town? Needed to pick up supplies, he said. His voice was low and measured, with a slight roughness that suggested he didn't use it more than necessary. Thought I'd stop by and see if that shirt I ordered was ready. It is. Let me get it. Margaret disappeared into the back room, leaving Lydia alone with Gavin Rourke. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she'd learned long ago that looking away was a sign of weakness, so she met his gaze steadily and waited. You're Lydia Hartwell, he said finally. It wasn't a question. I am. You were coming here to marry Sam Archer. Yes. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. That's a hard piece of luck. So I've been told. You planning to stay in Red Hollow? It was the same question everyone asked, and Lydia still didn't have a good answer. I haven't decided. You should know that winter here is harder than anything you've experienced in Philadelphia. The snow comes early and stays late. The temperature can drop to 20 below zero. If you're not prepared for it, you won't make it through. Lydia bristled at the assumption in his words. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Rourke. I don't doubt that, he said, but strength alone won't keep you warm when the wind's howling through the gaps in your walls and the firewood's running low. Before Lydia could respond, Margaret returned with a neatly wrapped package. Here you go, Gavin. That'll be $2. He paid without haggling, tucked the package under his arm, and turned back to Lydia. Miss Hartwell, I'd like to speak with you. Privately, if you're willing. There's a matter I'd like to discuss. Lydia glanced at Margaret, who gave her a slight nod that seemed to say, he's not dangerous, but be careful. All right, Lydia said. There's a restaurant 2 doors down. Would you join me for coffee? It was the middle of the afternoon, and there were people on the street. It seemed safe enough. Very well. Margaret watched them leave with an expression Lydia couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part concern, and perhaps a hint of approval. The restaurant was a modest establishment called the Prairie Rose, with 6 tables and a counter where a tired-looking woman served coffee and simple meals. Gavin gestured to a table by the window, and they sat down across from each other. The woman brought them coffee without being asked, and Gavin ordered a slice of apple pie that he didn't touch. I'll be direct, he said once they were alone. I know about your situation. You're living at the boarding house, working at the dress shop when there's work available, and trying to figure out how you're going to survive the winter. Lydia's first instinct was to be offended by his presumption, but she forced herself to stay calm. And why does my situation concern you, Mr. Rourke? Because I have a proposition for you. I need help at my ranch, and you need steady work and a place to stay. What kind of help? Housekeeper, bookkeeper, maybe help with cooking for the ranch hands during roundup season. My place isn't fancy, but it's solid. You'd have your own room, meals, and $20 a month. $20 a month. It was more than she could make in town, and it included room and board. But there was something about the offer that made her cautious. Why me? She asked. There must be other women in Red Hollow who could do that work. There are, he admitted. But none of them are in your position, and none of them need the work as badly as you do. More than that, I knew Sam Archer. He was a good man, and what happened to him was wrong. You came here in good faith, and you deserve better than to be stranded with no options. It was a surprisingly forthright answer, and Lydia found herself reassessing the man across from her. That's very charitable of you. It's not charity, he said firmly. I need the help, and I'm willing to pay for it. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. And what happens if I accept this offer and then you decide in a month that you don't need my services anymore? I'd be even more isolated than I am now. Fair point, Gavin said. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket and slid it across the table. I had this drawn up. It's a contract. 6 months guaranteed employment at $20 a month plus room and board. If either of us wants to terminate the arrangement before the 6 months are up, there's a 30-day notice period. Lydia unfolded the paper and read it carefully. It was exactly as he'd described, straightforward, with no hidden clauses or unexpected conditions. She looked up at him. This is very formal for hiring a housekeeper. I figured you'd want something in writing. Protection goes both ways. He was right about that. A written contract was far more than most women in her position could hope for. I'd need to think about it, she said. Take your time. I'll be in town until tomorrow afternoon. You can find me at the livery stable if you decide you're interested. He stood up, dropped some coins on the table to pay for the coffee, and picked up his hat. One more thing, Miss Hartwell. My ranch is 15 miles from town. You'd be relatively isolated, especially once winter sets in. There's no going back and forth to Red Hollow on a whim. If you accept this position, you need to be prepared to see it through. I understand. He nodded and walked out, leaving Lydia sitting alone with her coffee and a decision that felt far more significant than it should. She finished her coffee slowly, trying to think through all the angles. On the surface, it was a good offer. Better than anything else she was likely to find. But it also meant putting herself in a vulnerable position, living on an isolated ranch with a man she didn't know and ranch hands she'd never met. Then again, what choice did she really have? She could stay in Red Hollow, scraping by on irregular work and hoping her claim eventually resulted in enough money for train fare east. Or she could take a calculated risk on steady employment that would at least give her 6 months to figure out her next move. When she returned to the dress shop, Margaret looked up expectantly. Well, what did Gavin Rourke want? Lydia told her about the job offer and the contract. Margaret listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. Gavin's a good man, she said when Lydia finished. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's honest and he treats people fairly. I've never heard of him taking advantage of anyone. But he's also a man living alone on a ranch with no female relatives around. People will talk if you go work for him, even with a contract. Let them talk, Lydia said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. I didn't come 3,000 miles to worry about gossip. Margaret smiled. No, I don't suppose you did. She paused. For what it's worth, I think you should take the job. It's a better opportunity than anything you'll find here in town, and Gavin will keep his word. Just be clear about the boundaries from the start. That evening, Lydia lay awake in her room at the boarding house, listening to the wind and weighing her options. The contract sat on the small table beside her bed, visible in the moonlight that streamed through the window. By morning, she'd made her decision. She found Gavin Rourke at the livery stable as promised, checking over a wagon loaded with supplies. He looked up when she approached, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Mr. Rourke, she said, I've considered your offer, and I accept. When would you like me to start? Can you be ready to leave tomorrow morning? Yes. Then I'll pick you up at the boarding house at 7. Bring whatever you need, but pack light. The wagon's already loaded. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Lydia shook it. His grip was firm and calloused, the handshake brief and businesslike. One thing, Lydia said. I want it understood that this is strictly an employment arrangement. I'm not looking for anything beyond that. Neither am I, Gavin said. I need help running my ranch, not a wife. We're clear on that. The bluntness of his words should have been reassuring, but instead they left Lydia feeling oddly deflated. She pushed the feeling aside. This was business, nothing more. That's what she wanted. That's what they'd both agreed to. Then we have an understanding, she said. We do. Telling Mrs. Fletcher proved easier than expected. The older woman took the news with a pragmatic nod. Gavin Rourke's a good man, she said, echoing Margaret's assessment. You could do a lot worse. Just keep your wits about you and don't let loneliness make you foolish. I won't, Lydia promised. Her last evening in Red Hollow was quiet. She packed her belongings carefully, laying out her traveling clothes for the morning. The other boarders said polite goodbyes over supper, and the young clerk even wished her luck with what seemed like genuine sincerity. That night, lying in bed for the last time in that small room, Lydia thought about how quickly her life had changed. A week ago, she'd stepped off the train expecting to meet her future husband. Now she was preparing to ride out to an isolated ranch to work for a stranger who barely spoke 2 words at a time. But at least it was a future. At least it was something. When morning came, she was ready. Gavin arrived precisely at 7, driving the wagon with 2 horses harnessed to it. He helped Lydia load her suitcase without comment, then offered her his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. She took it, feeling the strength in his grip as he steadied her, then settled onto the hard wooden bench beside him. Ready? He asked. Ready. They rode out of Red Hollow as the sun was just clearing the eastern horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The town quickly fell away behind them, and soon there was nothing but endless grassland and the distant mountains standing like sentinels against the western sky. They didn't talk much during the journey. Gavin seemed comfortable with silence, and Lydia was too busy taking in the landscape to make conversation. It was beautiful in a harsh, uncompromising way. So different from the green hills and orderly farms of Pennsylvania that it might as well have been a different planet. The ranch road was little more than 2 ruts worn into the prairie grass. They followed it for what felt like hours before Lydia finally saw buildings in the distance. A house, a barn, several outbuildings, and corrals where horses stood watching their approach with lazy interest. That's Rourke Valley, Gavin said, breaking the long silence. The house was a simple structure, wood-framed and weathered but solid-looking. It had a front porch with a railing that needed mending and a chimney that was already sending up a thin trail of smoke. Someone was there, preparing for their arrival. As they drew closer, Lydia could see a man emerge from the barn, older, with a grizzled beard and a rolling gait that suggested years spent on horseback. He raised a hand in greeting as Gavin pulled the wagon to a stop. "That's Webb," Gavin said. "He's my foreman. Been with me since I started this place 5 years ago." Webb approached the wagon, his weathered face curious but not unwelcoming. "This the new housekeeper?" "This is Miss Hartwell," Gavin said. "Miss Hartwell, Webb Garrison." "Ma'am," Webb said, touching his hat. His voice was gravelly but not unkind. "Welcome to Rourke Valley." "Thank you, Mr. Garrison." "Just Webb is fine, ma'am. We don't stand much on formality out here." Gavin helped Lydia down from the wagon, then grabbed her suitcase from the back. "I'll show you the house," he said. "Webb, can you see to the horses?" "Sure thing, boss." The interior of the house was exactly what Lydia expected, functional but neglected. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large cast-iron stove, a scarred wooden table, and a few chairs that had seen better days. There were doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms, and a narrow staircase led to what must be a loft. "It's not much," Gavin said, setting her suitcase down. "Your room's through here." He led her to a small bedroom off the main room. It was spare, but clean. A bed with a simple quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the prairie. Someone had made an effort to sweep the floor and dust the surfaces. "Webb's been trying to keep the place livable," Gavin explained, "but we're neither of us much good at domestic work. That's why I need help." Lydia set her purse on the dresser and turned to face him. "What exactly do you need from me, Mr. Rourke?" "Call me Gavin. We're going to be working together. Might as well skip the formalities." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "The house needs regular cleaning and maintenance. The books need to be organized. I've got ledgers going back 3 years that are a mess. During roundup and branding season, we'll have extra hands who need feeding. And if you can do mending or basic medical care, that would be useful too." "I can do all of that," Lydia said. "What are the rules?" "Rules. Your expectations. When I need to be up, when meals should be ready, what's off limits?" Gavin considered this. I'm up before dawn most days. Coffee and breakfast whenever you can manage it. Supper around 6 unless I send word otherwise. The rest of the time is yours to organize as you see fit. As for what's off limits, my bedroom and the office are private. Everything else is fair game for cleaning and organizing. And the ranch hands? Right now it's just Webb and a younger fellow named Tom who helps with the horses. During busy seasons, we'll hire on extra help, but they sleep in the bunkhouse and keep to themselves. You won't have any trouble from them. Lydia nodded. When do you want me to start? Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow's soon enough. For today, just get settled in. He left her alone then, and Lydia unpacked her few belongings. It didn't take long. Her clothes went into the dresser, her brush and mirror on the washstand, her books and writing materials on the small shelf above the bed. The bundle of letters from Samuel Archer she tucked into the bottom drawer, out of sight. When she was finished, she stood in the center of the small room and took stock of her new reality. This was home now, at least for the next 6 months. A bedroom in a ranch house 15 miles from the nearest town, working for a man she barely knew in a land that still felt utterly foreign. But it was honest work, and it was a chance. That was more than she'd had a week ago. She ventured out into the main room and found Gavin sitting at the table, working through a stack of papers with a look of intense concentration. He glanced up when she entered. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes. I was wondering if you'd like coffee." That would be good. Thank you." Lydia found the coffee supplies and set about making a pot, familiarizing herself with the stove and the layout of the kitchen. The setup was basic, but functional. She could work with this. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups and brought one to Gavin. He accepted it with a nod of thanks, and she sat down across from him with her own cup. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Why did you really offer me this job? And please don't tell me it's just because you need help. You could have hired any number of women from Red Hollow." Gavin set down his pencil and met her eyes. "You want the honest answer?" "Always. I knew Sam Archer. Not well, but well enough to respect him. He talked about you, about the woman he was bringing out here to build a life with. He was excited about it, hopeful. When I heard what happened and then heard that you'd been left stranded," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "It seemed wrong. You came here in good faith, and you deserved better than to be left struggling in a town that didn't want you and couldn't help you. So it is charity." "No," he said firmly. "If I didn't actually need the help, I wouldn't have offered. But I'm not going to pretend that your situation didn't factor into my decision. It did. Is that a problem?" Lydia considered this. "No," she said finally. "I appreciate your honesty." "Good. Because that's the only way this arrangement is going to work, if we're honest with each other." They drank their coffee in silence, and Lydia found herself studying him when he returned his attention to his paperwork. He had the look of a man who'd worked hard for everything he had, someone who understood the value of persistence and didn't waste energy on things that didn't matter. That evening, she prepared her first meal in her new home, a simple supper of fried potatoes, beans, and the last of some bacon she found in the larder. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. Webb joined them at the table, along with Tom, a gangly young man who couldn't have been more than 19 and who blushed every time Lydia looked at him. The conversation was minimal, but not uncomfortable. The men talked about work that needed doing, fence repairs, a problem with one of the wells, plans for the upcoming cattle drive to the railroad depot. Lydia listened and learned, beginning to understand the rhythm and demands of ranch life. After supper, she cleaned up while the men went back outside to finish evening chores. When they were gone, she stood at the window and looked out at the darkening prairie. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. She thought about Philadelphia, about the life she'd left behind, about her father's church and her mother's garden and the narrow streets where she'd grown up. That world felt impossibly distant now, like something from another lifetime. This was her world now, this house, this prairie, this uncertain future. And somehow, she would have to make it work. The next morning, Lydia woke before dawn to the sound of boots on the porch and the low murmur of men's voices. She dressed quickly and emerged from her room to find Gavin standing at the stove, trying to coax life into a weak fire. "I've got that," she said. He stepped aside without argument. and within minutes she had a proper fire going and coffee brewing. By the time the sun rose, she'd prepared breakfast: eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy. The men ate with obvious appreciation, and even Gavin gave her an approving nod. After breakfast, she began her real work. The house was in worse shape than she'd initially thought: dust everywhere, floors that hadn't been properly swept in months, windows so dirty they barely let in light. She threw herself into cleaning with a determination that surprised even herself. By midday, the main room was transformed. The floors were swept and scrubbed, the windows cleaned until they sparkled, the stove polished until it shone. She'd found clean curtains in a trunk and hung them, brightening the whole space. When Gavin came in for lunch, he stopped in the doorway and looked around with an expression of genuine surprise. "You've been busy," he said. "This is just the start," Lydia replied. "Tomorrow I'll tackle the bedrooms, and then I need to see those ledgers you mentioned." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "I can see I made the right decision hiring you. We'll see if you still think that when I start reorganizing your office." This time he did smile, a real one, though brief. "Fair warning, Miss Hartwell. I don't take kindly to people moving my things around." "Then I'll make sure everything has a proper place and a proper label," she said. "That way you'll always be able to find what you need." Over the following days, Lydia established a routine. She rose before dawn, prepared breakfast, and then spent her days cleaning, organizing, and slowly bringing order to the chaos of the ranch house. The ledgers were indeed a disaster: 3 years of haphazard record-keeping with half the entries illegible and the other half incomplete. She spent hours deciphering Gavin's handwriting and Webb's even worse scrawl, creating a proper system for tracking expenses, livestock, and sales. In the evenings, after supper, she would sometimes sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. Often Gavin would join her, not saying much but simply sharing the silence. She found his presence oddly comforting, solid and dependable, like the house itself. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Webb approached her as she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. "Miss Hartwell, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Webb." "How long are you planning to stay out here?" It was a fair question, though not an easy one to answer. "My contract is for 6 months." "And after that?" "I don't know yet." Webb nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "I hope you stay. Place has felt more like a home these past 2 weeks than it has in all the time I've been here. Boss is different too." "Different how?" "Less wound up. He's always been serious about the work, but lately he's been easier somehow. Smiles more, talks more." Webb shifted his weight. "I think having you here's been good for him." Lydia didn't know what to say to that, so she simply thanked Webb and continued hanging the laundry. But his words stayed with her. That night, as she was preparing for bed, she heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Gavin standing there holding a small wooden box. "Sorry to disturb you," he said, "but I thought you should have this." He handed her the box. Inside was a small Derringer pistol and a box of ammunition. "For protection," he explained. "You're isolated out here, and I'm often away from the house during the day. I want you to know how to defend yourself if necessary." Lydia stared at the weapon. "I've never fired a gun." "I'll teach you, tomorrow, if you're willing." She looked up at him, at the serious expression on his face, and realized that this was his way of showing he cared about her safety. It was practical, unsentimental, and entirely in keeping with who he was. "All right," she said, "tomorrow." The shooting lesson took place the next afternoon behind the barn. Gavin was patient and thorough, showing her how to load the pistol, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. The first few shots went wild, the recoil surprising her, but gradually she got the feel of it. "You're a quick study," Gavin said, after she managed to hit the tin can he'd set up as a target. "I've always been good at learning new things," Lydia replied, surprising herself with how much satisfaction she felt from hitting that target. As they walked back to the house together, Lydia found herself thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. She was learning to shoot, to cook for ranch hands, to keep books and manage supplies. She was becoming someone she barely recognized, someone stronger and more capable than the woman who'd stepped off that train in Red Hollow. And Gavin Rourke, the quiet rancher who'd offered her a lifeline, was becoming something more than just her employer. She caught herself watching him sometimes, the way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, The concentration on his face when he was working through a difficult problem, the rare moments when he laughed at something Webb said. It was dangerous, she knew. She couldn't afford to develop feelings for him. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. She had to remember that. But as the weeks passed and autumn deepened into early winter, Lydia found it increasingly difficult to maintain that professional distance. Because the truth was, she was happy here. Happier than she'd been in years. And that terrified her more than anything else. The first snow came in early November, 3 months after Lydia's arrival at Rourke Valley. She woke to an unfamiliar silence, that peculiar quiet that only fresh snow can bring. And when she looked out her window, the entire world had been transformed into something clean and white and impossibly beautiful. She dressed quickly and stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tight against the cold. The prairie stretched before her like a blank page, unmarked except for the delicate tracks of small animals that had ventured out in search of food. The mountains in the distance stood stark against a pale gray sky, their peaks lost in clouds that promised more snow to come. "First one's always the prettiest," Gavin said from behind her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered her one, and she took it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm ceramic. "How much will we get?" she asked. "This is just a dusting. The real storms won't come for another few weeks." He sipped his coffee and gazed out at the white landscape. "But when they do, we'll be snowed in for days at a time. Maybe longer." The thought should have frightened her, but instead Lydia felt a strange sense of anticipation. She'd spent the past months preparing for winter, organizing supplies, preserving food, making sure the house was properly sealed against the cold. She'd sewn heavy curtains for the windows, restuffed mattresses with fresh straw, and even helped Gavin and Webb stack firewood until the pile beside the house stood taller than she was. "We're ready," she said, as much to herself as to him. Gavin glanced at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. It was the way he looked at her sometimes now, not as an employee, not as a temporary arrangement, but as something else entirely, something neither of them had named. "Yes," he said quietly, "we are." They stood there together in the cold morning air, drinking their coffee and watching the snow. And Lydia felt the weight of all the unspoken things between them pressing down like the heavy clouds overhead. The dynamic between them had shifted gradually over the past months, so slowly that Lydia hadn't noticed until it was already too late to stop it. There were small moments. His hand on her elbow when she stumbled on uneven ground, the way he always made sure she had the warmest seat by the fire, how he'd started asking her opinion on ranch decisions instead of just telling her what he'd decided. And her own responses, the extra care she took with his meals, the way she'd started mending his clothes without being asked, how her heart would lift when she heard his boots on the porch at the end of the day. Webb had noticed. She'd caught him watching them with a knowing expression more than once, though he'd been kind enough not to comment. Even young Tom had picked up on something, blushing furiously whenever he accidentally interrupted them talking. But Lydia kept telling herself it didn't mean anything. She was lonely, that was all. And Gavin was simply being kind to someone in his employ. The contract had 3 months left. After that, she would need to make a decision about her future, whether to stay in Colorado or use whatever money she'd saved to return east. The thought of leaving made her chest ache in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. Over breakfast that morning, Webb announced he'd be riding into Red Hollow for supplies. "Storm's coming in a few days," he said, sopping up gravy with a biscuit. "Want to make sure we've got everything we need before we're stuck here." "I'll come with you," Gavin said. "Need to check on the auction results for the Archer place. Should have been finalized by now." Lydia's hands stilled on the coffee pot. She'd almost forgotten about Samuel Archer's ranch, about the auction that would determine who controlled the land that was supposed to have been her home. "Did you bid on it?" she asked Gavin. He nodded. "Against Jake Mooney, mostly. His offer was higher, but the cousin wanted someone who'd actually work the land, not just consolidate water rights. I made the case that I'd honor Sam's original intentions for the place. And if you won, then Rourke Valley doubles in size, and we have secure water access for years to come." He met her eyes across the table. "It's a good piece of land, Lydia. Sam chose well." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his low voice sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the coffee she was drinking. "I'd like to come too," she said. To Red Hollow. I haven't been to town since I left, and there are things I need. Gavin considered this. It'll be a long, cold ride. I can manage. All right, then. We leave in an hour. The ride to Red Hollow was indeed cold, but Lydia didn't mind. She sat beside Gavin on the wagon seat, bundled in her warmest coat with a blanket across her lap, watching the snow-dusted prairie roll past. Webb rode ahead on horseback, scouting the road and keeping watch for any problems. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable now. Lydia had grown accustomed to Gavin's quiet nature, had learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression that told her more than words ever could. She could tell when he was worried by the slight furrow between his brows, could see when he was pleased by the way the corners of his mouth would quirk up almost imperceptibly. Right now, he seemed thoughtful, his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind clearly somewhere else. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He glanced at her, surprised by the question. "The future," he said after a moment. "What comes next?" "For the ranch?" "For everything." He paused, choosing his words carefully. 3 months ago, I was running this place alone with just Webb and Tom for company. Now, there's hot meals every day, the house is actually livable, and the books are in better shape than they've been in years. It's made me realize what I've been missing. Lydia's heart was beating faster than it should. "And what's that?" But before he could answer, Webb came riding back toward them at a quick trot. "Rider coming," he called out. "Looks like Jake Mooney." Gavin's expression hardened. He pulled the wagon to a stop and waited as a man on a large bay horse approached from the south. Even from a distance, Lydia could tell this was someone used to getting his way. He sat his horse with the arrogant confidence of a man who'd never been told no. Jake Mooney was perhaps 40, with sandy hair going gray at the temples and cold blue eyes that swept over their wagon with calculating interest. His gaze lingered on Lydia in a way that made her skin crawl. "Rourke," he said, nodding curtly at Gavin. "Heard you were trying to steal the Archer place out from under me." "I made a fair bid at auction," Gavin said evenly. "Same as you." "Fair?" Mooney laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know that land should be mine. I need that water access." "Then you should have made a better offer." "I offered more money." "Money isn't everything, Mooney. The man's family wanted someone who'd respect what Sam built, someone who wouldn't just tear it down to consolidate holdings." Mooney's eyes narrowed. "You always did think you were better than everyone else, Rourke. But you're just another dirt farmer trying to scratch out a living on land that's too hard for you." "If you've got something to say it," Gavin said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm saying the auction's not final yet. I've got lawyers looking into irregularities. And I'm saying you should think real careful about whether you want to make an enemy of me." Mooney's gaze slid back to Lydia. "Especially when you've got responsibilities now. Pretty thing like that needs protecting in country this rough." Gavin's hand moved to the rifle beside him, the motion subtle but unmistakable. "You threatening me, Mooney?" "Just making conversation." Mooney smiled, showing teeth. "But accidents happen out here. Fences get cut, cattle wander off, fires start. Be a shame if something happened to that nice ranch house you've got." Webb had moved his horse closer, his hand resting on his own rifle. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. "You've said your piece," Gavin said. "Now move along." For a moment, Mooney looked like he might push it further. Then he shrugged and gathered his reins. "We'll be seeing each other soon, Rourke. You can count on that." He tipped his hat mockingly at Lydia. "Ma'am." Then he spurred his horse and rode off toward the south, leaving them in the middle of the snow-covered road. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Finally, Webb broke the silence. "That man's going to be trouble." "He's been trouble since the day he moved here," Gavin said. He looked at Lydia, his expression tight with concern. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "Is he dangerous?" Lydia asked. "He's a bully, with money, and no scruples," Webb said bluntly. "And yes, he's dangerous. Sam Archer found that out the hard way." The reminder hung heavy between them as they continued toward Red Hollow. Lydia found herself thinking about Samuel Archer, about the man she'd traveled 3,000 miles to marry and never met, about the dispute over water that had cost him his life. And now Gavin was stepping into the same fight. "Maybe you should withdraw your bid," she said quietly. Gavin shook his head. That land is important, not just for the water, but for what it represents. If men like Mooney can kill someone and then profit from it, what does that say about this place? What kind of future can we build if we let that stand? We. The word resonated in Lydia's chest, heavy with implication. Red Hollow looked different under its blanket of snow. The rough edges were softened, the poverty and dust temporarily hidden under white. People moved along the sidewalks with their heads down against the cold, going about their business with the determined efficiency of those who knew winter was just beginning. Webb headed to the general store for supplies while Gavin went to the land office. Lydia made her way to Margaret's dress shop, eager to see a friendly face. Margaret looked up from her sewing when the door opened and her face broke into a genuine smile. "Lydia, I was wondering when you'd make it back to town." She set down her work and came around the counter to embrace her. "Let me look at you. You look different." "Different how?" "Stronger, healthier, like you're actually thriving instead of just surviving." Margaret stepped back, still holding Lydia's hands. "Ranch life agrees with you." "It does," Lydia admitted, "more than I expected." "And Gavin Rourke, how's that arrangement working out?" Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's fine. He's been very professional." "Professional," Margaret repeated, her eyes twinkling. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Margaret, I'm just teasing, but I've seen the way that man looks at you when he thinks no one's watching, and I'm guessing you look at him the same way." Lydia wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat, because Margaret was right. She did look at Gavin that way. And lately, she'd caught him looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch and her pulse race. "It's complicated," she said finally. "It always is," Margaret replied. "But that doesn't make it wrong. You deserve happiness, Lydia. Both of you do." They spent the next hour talking while Lydia picked out fabric for new curtains and some thread for mending. Margaret filled her in on the town gossip, who was courting whom, which businesses were struggling, how the new school teacher had quit after 2 weeks because she couldn't handle the isolation. "They're desperate for a teacher," Margaret said. "The children are running wild. Mrs. Henderson's been trying to teach them basic reading in her parlor, but she's 73 and doesn't have the energy for it." Lydia thought about the ranch hands' children she'd met during the brief period when extra help had been hired for cattle branding. Bright, curious kids with no access to education beyond what their parents could provide. "I could teach," she said slowly. "Not full-time, but maybe once a week. I could come into town on Saturdays and hold classes at the church or somewhere." Margaret's eyes lit up. "Would you really do that?" "I'd have to discuss it with Gavin, make sure he doesn't need me at the ranch on Saturdays, but yes, I think I would." It was the first time Lydia had thought beyond her 6-month contract, the first time she'd made plans that assumed she'd still be here. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She found Gavin at the land office, talking with Edgar Pritchard. Both men looked up when she entered, and Pritchard greeted her warmly. "Miss Hartwell, good to see you looking so well." "Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. How are things progressing with my claim?" "Slowly, I'm afraid. These things take time. But I'm optimistic we'll see some resolution in the next few months." He glanced at Gavin. "I was just telling Mr. Rourke that his bid for the Archer property has been accepted. The sale will be finalized next week." Lydia looked at Gavin, saw the satisfaction in his expression tempered by something that looked like relief. "Congratulations," she said. "Thank you." He turned back to Pritchard. "Mooney stopped us on the road, made some veiled threats about the sale not being final." Pritchard's expression darkened. "He's been in here twice trying to find grounds to contest it, but the auction was legal and the family's decision was clear. He doesn't have a case." "That won't stop him from causing trouble," Gavin said. "No," Pritchard agreed. "It won't. You should be careful, Gavin. Jake Mooney's not the kind of man to accept defeat gracefully." They left the land office with that warning hanging over them like the heavy clouds promising more snow. Webb had the wagon loaded and ready to go, and they started back toward the ranch as the afternoon light began to fade. The snow that had been threatening all day finally began to fall as they left Red Hollow behind, large, wet flakes that stuck to everything and reduced visibility to just a few yards. Gavin urged the horses faster, wanting to get home before the storm got worse. "We should have stayed in town," Webb said, riding alongside the wagon now. This is going to get bad. We're closer to the ranch than to Red Hollow, Gavin said. We pushed through. But pushing through proved harder than expected. The snow came down heavier and heavier, driven by a wind that seemed to cut straight through their clothes. The horses struggled in the deepening drifts, and soon Lydia couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. She huddled under the blanket, trying to keep warm, but the cold was relentless. Her fingers and toes had gone numb, and she could feel herself starting to shiver uncontrollably. Gavin noticed. He pulled her closer against his side, sharing his warmth, keeping one arm around her while he guided the horses with the other. Not much farther, he said, his voice rough with cold and concern. Just hold on. Lydia pressed against him, drawing on his warmth and his strength. She trusted him completely in that moment, trusted him to get them home safely through the blinding snow. It felt like hours, but was probably less than one when she finally saw the dark shape of the ranch house emerging from the white. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a wave of exhaustion so profound she could barely stay upright. Gavin pulled the wagon up to the porch and jumped down, then reached up for Lydia. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate, and she half fell into his arms. He caught her easily and carried her toward the house while Webb saw to the horses. Inside, the house was cold, but at least sheltered from the wind. Gavin set Lydia down in a chair near the stove and immediately began building up the fire. Within minutes, flames were crackling and heat was beginning to fill the room. "Get those wet things off," he ordered, pulling off his own coat and gloves. "I'll make coffee." Lydia's hands were shaking too badly to manage the buttons on her coat. Gavin saw her struggling and knelt in front of her, his fingers working the frozen fastenings with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the urgency in his movements. He helped her out of the coat, then wrapped a dry blanket around her shoulders. "Better?" he asked, his face close to hers, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that had nothing to do with the cold. "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you." He held her gaze for a long moment, and Lydia felt something shift between them, a barrier breaking, a truth acknowledged. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek, and she leaned into his touch without thinking. The door banged open and Webb stumbled in, snow-covered and cursing the storm. The moment broke, and Gavin stood quickly, moving to help his foreman. But Lydia could still feel the warmth of his hand on her face, could still see the look in his eyes. Something had changed between them in those few seconds, something that couldn't be unchanged. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights. They were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in the ranch house while the snow piled higher and higher against the walls. Webb and Tom stayed in the bunkhouse most of the time, venturing out only to tend to the animals and then retreating back to shelter. Lydia and Gavin were essentially alone together, and the forced proximity made the tension between them almost unbearable. They moved around each other carefully, always aware of where the other was, always conscious of the narrow space they shared. On the second night, unable to sleep, Lydia came out of her room to find Gavin sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Too much on my mind." She sat down in the chair across from him, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. Outside, the wind howled and the snow kept falling. "Tell me about it," she said. Gavin was quiet for a long time, and Lydia thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I keep thinking about what Mooney said, about responsibilities, about you. I can take care of myself. I know you can. You've proven that over and over, but that doesn't mean I don't worry." He looked at her then, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "When I saw you on that wagon in the storm, shivering and cold, all I could think was that I'd put you in danger by insisting we push through. And if something had happened to you—" He trailed off, but the unspoken words hung in the air between them. "Nothing happened," Lydia said gently. "We made it home. This time. But Mooney's threat wasn't idle, Lydia. He meant it. And if he decides to retaliate for losing the auction, this ranch will be the target, which means you'll be in the line of fire." "Then I'll learn to shoot better," she said, trying to lighten the mood. "You've already taught me the basics." But Gavin didn't smile. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "Your contract is up in 3 months," he said. "After that, you're free to go back east if you want." Might be safer if you did. The words hit Lydia like a physical blow. After everything, after all the careful distance they'd maintained and the feelings they'd tried to deny, he was suggesting she leave. Is that what you want? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What I want doesn't matter. It matters to me. Gavin looked up at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes took her breath away. Want and fear, and something deeper, something that looked like the same feeling that had been growing in her own heart these past months. No, he said finally. It's not what I want. Not even close. Lydia stood and crossed the space between them, kneeling beside his chair the way he'd knelt beside hers during the storm. She took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and the strength, the warmth that had become so familiar. Then ask me to stay, she said. Not as an employee, not because of a contract. Ask me to stay because you want me here. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the crackling of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Gavin's hands tightened on hers, and she could see him struggling with something, fear perhaps, or the weight of vulnerability. I can't, he said finally, and Lydia felt her heart crack. Not yet. Not until the situation with Mooney is resolved. I won't ask you to tie yourself to a future that might not exist. That's not your decision to make alone, Lydia said, her voice fierce. I came west to build a new life. Maybe it wasn't supposed to be with you, but that's how it's turned out. And I'm not afraid of Jake Mooney or hard winters or any of it. I'm only afraid of losing what we have before we've even had a chance to see what it could become. Gavin pulled her closer, and suddenly she was in his arms, his face buried in her hair, his heart beating hard against her chest. I've never been good with words, he said roughly. Never knew how to say what I feel. But since the day I saw you standing at that train station, lost and alone and trying so hard to be brave, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. And these past months, having you here, working beside you, watching you turn this house into a home, his voice broke. I don't know how to let you go. Then don't, Lydia whispered. She pulled back just enough to look into his face. I'm not asking for promises or certainty. I'm just asking for honesty. Tell me what you feel. The firelight flickered across Gavin's features as he searched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. I'm falling in love with you, Lydia. Maybe I have been since the beginning. And it scares me more than anything I've ever faced, because I've never had anything this important to lose. Tears sprang to Lydia's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief and joy and recognition, because she finally understood that what she'd been feeling wasn't one-sided, wasn't foolish, wasn't wrong. I love you too, she said. I think I have for weeks now, but I was too afraid to admit it. Gavin's hand moved to the back of her neck, drawing her closer, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, almost tentative, then deeper as she responded. It was nothing like the chaste kisses she'd received from nervous suitors back in Philadelphia. This was raw and real, full of all the emotion they'd been holding back for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gavin rested his forehead against hers. This changes things, he said. Yes, Lydia agreed. It does. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I can protect you from Mooney or if the ranch will survive the winter or any of it. I don't need you to have all the answers, Lydia said. I just need you to be honest with me, to face whatever comes next together instead of alone. Together, Gavin repeated, as if testing the word. Then he smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. I like the sound of that. They stayed by the fire until the flames burned low, talking in quiet voices about the future they might build together. Gavin told her about his plans for the ranch, how acquiring the Archer property would give them room to expand, to build something that would last. Lydia talked about her idea of teaching the local children, maybe even starting a real school eventually. You'd be good at that, Gavin said. You've got the patience for it, and the determination. I learned determination from you, Lydia replied. Watching you work this ranch, never giving up no matter how hard it gets, that taught me more than I could have imagined. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease. The wind had dropped from a howl to a whisper, and through the window Lydia could see hints of stars appearing between the clouds. Storm's breaking, Gavin observed. Yes, Lydia said, but we survived it. He pulled her closer. We did, and we'll survive whatever else comes. It was a promise neither of them could guarantee, but in that moment, wrapped in his arms with the fire warming them and the future stretching out before them like the vast prairie, Lydia believed him. They'd survived worse already. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The morning after the storm broke dawned clear and brutally cold. Lydia woke to find frost crystals on the inside of her window and her breath visible in the air. She dressed quickly, layering wool and flannel against the cold, and emerged from her room to find Gavin already up, feeding wood into the stove. He looked up when she entered, and the smile that crossed his face was different now. Warmer, more open, carrying the weight of what they'd acknowledged to each other the night before. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning." Lydia crossed to him, and he pulled her close for a brief kiss that still made her pulse quicken. "How bad is it out there?" 3 feet of snow in the drifts, maybe more. We'll need to dig out paths to the barn and the well, check on the livestock, make sure none of them froze. He stroked her hair back from her face. "It'll be hard work." "Then we'd better get started." They worked side by side for hours, shoveling snow and breaking ice from water troughs. Webb and Tom joined them, and together they managed to clear paths and confirm that all the animals had survived the storm. 2 calves had gotten separated from their mothers and were half frozen, but they managed to get them into the barn and warmed up before it was too late. By midday, Lydia's arms ached and her hands were raw despite her gloves, but there was satisfaction in the work. This was survival in its most basic form, fighting against nature to protect what was theirs. Over lunch, Webb brought up the subject everyone had been avoiding. "Need to ride the fence line soon as the snow settles," he said, spooning stew into his mouth. "Make sure nothing's broken, and we should check the Archer property too now that it's ours." "Our fence lines first," Gavin said. "Then we'll assess what needs doing on the new land." "Mooney's not going to let this go quiet," Webb continued. "You know that, right?" "I know." Tom, who rarely spoke during meals, looked up from his plate. "There's talk in town. Some of Mooney's hands have been saying things about how no one crosses their boss and gets away with it." Lydia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What kind of things?" "Just talk, ma'am, but mean talk. The kind that usually comes before trouble." Gavin's expression hardened. "Then we'll be ready for trouble. I want both of you armed when you're out on the range, and I want someone at the ranch house at all times. We don't leave Lydia here alone." "I can take care of myself," Lydia protested. "I know you can," Gavin said, his tone brooking no argument. "But that doesn't mean you should have to. This is my fight, and I won't have you paying the price for it." After the men went back out to finish the day's work, Lydia stood at the window and watched Gavin moving through the snow toward the barn. His words echoed in her mind. "This is my fight." But it wasn't. Not anymore. The moment she told him she loved him, the moment she decided to build a future here, it had become her fight too. That evening, after supper, Gavin spread a map of the ranch holdings across the table. The new Archer property nearly doubled their acreage and, more importantly, secured their water rights to Crane Creek. "This changes everything," he said, tracing the property lines with his finger. "We can run twice as many cattle, maybe build a second bunkhouse for seasonal workers. The grazing land here is some of the best in the territory." Lydia studied the map, seeing not just land but possibility. "What about a schoolhouse?" Gavin looked up at her, surprised. "A schoolhouse? You said we'd have seasonal workers. They'll bring families, children who need education." She pointed to a spot near the center of the combined properties. "Here. Close enough to be accessible but far enough from the main operations not to interfere with ranch work." Something shifted in Gavin's expression. Respect, admiration, and something deeper. "You're thinking long term, aren't you?" "Yes," he said quietly. "But I wasn't sure you were." Lydia took his hand across the map. "I told you I loved you. That wasn't conditional on everything being safe or easy. That was a commitment to whatever comes next." Gavin turned her hand over, studying her palm where calluses had formed from months of ranch work. These hands used to be soft, city hands. "They were useless hands," Lydia said. "Now they can mend fences and milk cows and shoot straight when they need to. And they're beautiful, Gavin said, lifting her hand to his lips. Because they chose to stay when they could have run. The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Gavin's expression changed instantly, his body tensing as he moved to answer it. His hand rested on the gun at his hip. "Who is it?" he called. "Edgar Pritchard, from the land office." "I need to speak with you, Gavin. It's urgent." Gavin opened the door to reveal the land agent standing on the porch, snow-covered and clearly agitated. He stepped aside to let the man in. "What's happened?" Gavin asked. Pritchard removed his hat and nodded to Lydia before addressing Gavin. "There's been a development with your purchase. Jake Mooney filed an injunction this afternoon, claiming irregularities in the auction process. Says you had inside information that gave you an unfair advantage." "That's a lie," Gavin said flatly. "I know it is, but he's got lawyers from Denver, and they're making enough noise that the judge has agreed to hear arguments. Until the case is settled, the sale is frozen." Lydia felt her stomach drop. What does that mean? It means Gavin doesn't officially own the Archer property yet. Can't make improvements to it, can't move livestock onto it, can't do anything until the legal challenge is resolved. "How long will that take?" Gavin asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Could be weeks. Could be months. Judge Morrison's thorough, and Mooney's team is going to drag this out as long as possible." Pritchard shifted uncomfortably. "There's more. Mooney's made it clear he's willing to offer you a settlement. He'll buy the property from you for 20% over what you paid and drop the lawsuit." "He wants me to sell out." "Essentially, yes." Gavin's laugh was harsh and bitter. "He kills Sam Archer, tries to steal his land at auction, and when that doesn't work, he uses the courts to force me to sell to him anyway. And I'm supposed to just roll over and take it?" "I'm not saying you should," Pritchard said carefully. "I'm just telling you what he's offering." "Tell him no," Gavin said immediately. "Gavin, you should think about this," Pritchard urged. "Mooney's got resources you don't have. He can keep you tied up in court for years if he wants to. And even if you eventually win, the legal fees could bankrupt you." "Then I'll be bankrupt," Gavin said, "but I won't give him what he wants. Not after what he did to Sam." Lydia stepped forward. "What are our other options?" Pritchard looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten she was part of this decision. "You could countersue for harassment and abuse of legal process. It would cost money you probably don't have, but it might force Mooney to back down. Or it might make him angrier," Gavin said. "Probably," Pritchard admitted. "Jake Mooney doesn't like being challenged." After Pritchard left, Gavin paced the room like a caged animal, his frustration palpable. Lydia let him work through it, knowing he needed to process before he could think clearly. Finally, he stopped at the window, staring out at the snow-covered prairie. "I'm sorry," he said without turning around. "For what?" "For dragging you into this. You came here for a fresh start, and instead you've gotten caught up in a range war with a man who's already killed once." Lydia crossed to him and turned him to face her. "I chose this. I chose you, and I'm not going anywhere." "Lydia." "No, listen to me." Her voice was fierce. "I spent my whole life in Philadelphia being told what I could and couldn't do, where I belonged and where I didn't. I was too independent for society, too educated for my own good, too stubborn to be a proper wife. And then I came here, to this impossible place, and I found out who I really am. I'm strong. I'm capable. And I don't run from fights that matter." Gavin cupped her face in his hands. "This could get dangerous. Life is dangerous. Crossing the street in Philadelphia was dangerous. At least here, I'm fighting for something that matters. For land that could be ours. For a future we could build together. Our future might be tied up in court for years. Then we'll wait. And while we're waiting, we'll work this ranch and make it the best operation in the territory. We'll show Mooney and everyone else that we're not going anywhere." Something in Gavin's expression shifted from anger to determination. "You're right. We fight this. Not just in court, but by proving we deserve this land more than he ever could." "Exactly." He kissed her then, hard and fierce, and Lydia kissed him back with all the determination and passion she felt. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Gavin's eyes were blazing. "Marry me," he said. The words hung in the air between them. Lydia's heart stopped, then started again, racing. "What?" "Marry me," Gavin repeated, his voice steady now. Sure. Not because of Mooney or the lawsuit or any of that. Marry me because I love you and I can't imagine building this future with anyone else. Marry me because when I think about tomorrow and next year and 10 years from now, you're in every single vision. Marry me because you are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of you. Tears sprang to Lydia's eyes. You already are worthy of me. You have been since the day you offered me a job when everyone else saw me as a problem to be solved. Is that a yes? Yes, Lydia said, laughing through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you. Gavin swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the small room while she laughed and clung to his shoulders. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools. We should do it soon, he said, before winter gets worse. We can ride into Red Hollow, find the minister, make it official. Gavin Rourke, Lydia said, touching his face. Are you trying to rush me to the altar? Absolutely. I've wasted enough time being careful and professional. I want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours. The possessiveness in his voice sent warmth through her. Then let's do it. Then let's do this week, before the next storm. They spent that evening making plans. Simple ones, because neither of them wanted anything elaborate. A small ceremony in Red Hollow, with Webb and Tom as witnesses, maybe Margaret and Mrs. Fletcher in attendance. Then back to the ranch to start their lives together, officially and irrevocably joined. Lydia lay awake that night in her small room, thinking about how much had changed since she'd stepped off that train 4 months ago. She'd come to Red Hollow as Lydia Hartwell, a mail-order bride who'd lost her groom before she'd even met him. Soon she would be Lydia Rourke, a rancher's wife building a life in the hardest, most beautiful place she'd ever known. The transformation felt both impossible and inevitable. 2 days later, they rode into Red Hollow under a clear blue sky. The town was still half buried in snow, but the main street had been cleared enough for wagons and horses to pass. They went first to the minister's house, a small cottage behind the church, where Reverend Matthews agreed to perform the ceremony the following afternoon. Short notice, he observed, but his eyes were kind. But then again, life out here doesn't always allow for long engagements. No, Gavin agreed. It doesn't. Margaret's reaction when they told her was pure delight. She immediately began planning what Lydia should wear, pulling out bolts of fabric and suggesting modifications to Lydia's best dress. You need something special, she insisted. Even if it's just a simple ceremony, you deserve to look beautiful. I don't need... Yes, you do. Every bride needs to feel beautiful on her wedding day. Now hush and let me work. Mrs. Fletcher was more pragmatic in her congratulations, but there was genuine warmth in her eyes. About time, she said. I've been watching you two dance around each other for months. Good to see you've finally got the sense to make it official. That evening, Gavin took Lydia to dinner at the Prairie Rose. It was the same restaurant where he'd first offered her the job at his ranch, and the symmetry wasn't lost on either of them. Feels like a lifetime ago, Lydia said, looking around the modest room. I was so scared that day, so uncertain about everything. You didn't show it, Gavin said. You looked me straight in the eye and negotiated terms like you were born to it. I was terrified you'd see through me, see how desperate I really was. I did see it, Gavin admitted. That's partly why I made the offer, but it was also because I saw your strength underneath the fear. Saw that you were someone who'd survived being knocked down and was determined to get back up again. And now? Now I see the woman you were always meant to be. Strong, capable, brilliant. My equal in every way that matters. Lydia reached across the table and took his hand. I never thought I'd find this. A partner who sees me as an equal instead of a burden or an ornament. Someone who challenges me to be better while accepting exactly who I am. Lydia, Gavin said seriously, I need you to understand something. Tomorrow, when we stand in front of Reverend Matthews, I'm not just marrying you because I love you. I'm choosing you as my partner in every sense. That means your voice matters in every decision we make about the ranch, about our future, about everything. This isn't about me taking care of you or protecting you. It's about us facing everything together, as equals. I know, Lydia said softly. That's why I said yes. They walked back to the boarding house through snow-cleared streets, hand in hand, and Lydia felt a peace she hadn't known since childhood. Tomorrow she would become someone's wife, but not in the way she'd once imagined. This wasn't about duty or social expectation or escaping spinsterhood. This was about choice and love and partnership. The wedding day dawned cold but clear. Margaret arrived at the boarding house early to help Lydia dress, bringing the modified gown she'd stayed up late finishing. It was a deep blue wool, elegantly simple, with pearl buttons down the front and lace at the collar and cuffs. "Something borrowed," Margaret said, producing a delicate silver comb. "It was my mother's. For your hair." "Margaret, I can't." "Yes, you can. You're the closest thing to a sister I've had in this town. Let me do this." Lydia blinked back tears as Margaret arranged her hair and secured it with the comb. When she looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Gone was the frightened girl from Philadelphia. In her place stood someone strong and sure, ready to claim her future. The ceremony was held in the small church, with weak winter sunlight streaming through the windows. Webb and Tom stood as witnesses, along with Margaret and Mrs. Fletcher. Edgar Pritchard had even come, bringing word that the legal proceedings wouldn't begin for another 2 weeks. "Thought you'd want to enjoy your wedding day without that hanging over you," he said. Lydia wore her best dress and the borrowed comb and carried a small bouquet of dried wildflowers that Margaret had somehow produced. Gavin wore a clean shirt and his best jacket, his dark hair still damp from washing. When he saw Lydia walking toward him down the short aisle, his expression transformed. Love and wonder and something like awe crossed his features, and Lydia felt her own heart swell in response. Reverend Matthews kept the ceremony brief and simple. The traditional words felt weighty and real as they repeated them back. Promises of love and loyalty, of partnership through hardship and joy, of facing whatever came together. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Gavin kissed her with a tenderness that made the small gathering smile. It wasn't a long kiss or a particularly passionate one, but it carried the weight of everything they'd been through and everything they'd promised each other. "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Gavin Rourke," the Reverend announced, and the witnesses applauded. The celebration afterward was modest: coffee and cake at the boarding house, conversation and laughter that felt warm despite the cold day. Margaret pulled Lydia aside at one point, her eyes bright with tears. "I'm so happy for you," she said. "When you first arrived here, so lost and alone, I wasn't sure you'd make it. But you proved everyone wrong. You made a place for yourself here." "I had help," Lydia said, glancing at Gavin across the room, "from people who saw more in me than I saw in myself." "That's what good people do," Margaret said. "They help each other become who they're meant to be." As the sun began to set, Gavin and Lydia said their goodbyes and began the journey back to the ranch. Webb and Tom had ridden ahead earlier to tend to the evening chores, giving the newlyweds privacy on the wagon ride home. The prairie stretched before them in shades of gold and purple, the snow glittering in the fading light. Lydia sat close to Gavin on the wagon seat, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, testing the name. "How does it feel?" "Right," Lydia answered. "It feels exactly right." "Any regrets? Any second thoughts about tying yourself to a stubborn rancher with a lawsuit hanging over his head?" "Our heads," Lydia corrected. "We're in this together now, remember? And no regrets at all." The ranch house came into view as darkness fell, its windows glowing with lamplight. Webb had left the lamps burning for them, a welcoming gesture that touched Lydia more than she'd expected. Inside, the house felt different somehow, warmer, more complete. This was their home now, officially and irrevocably. Everything in it belonged to both of them, and everything they built from this point forward would be built together. That night, lying in Gavin's arms in what was now their shared bedroom, Lydia thought about the journey that had brought her here. The train from Philadelphia, the devastating news at the station, the desperate weeks of trying to survive, and then the unexpected offer from a quiet rancher who'd seen something in her worth saving. "What are you thinking about?" Gavin murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "About how I came here to marry one man and ended up with someone completely different, someone better." Better than a stranger you only knew through letters? Better than anything I could have imagined, Lydia said. I thought I was coming west for security, for a practical arrangement that would give me a place to belong. But what I found was so much more than that. I found partnership and respect and love. I found a place where I could be strong instead of ornamental. I found you. Gavin pulled her closer. I thought I was fine alone. Thought I had everything I needed with the ranch and the work and the quiet. Then you stepped into my life and showed me everything I was missing. You made me want more. Not just more land or more cattle, but more life. More connection. More purpose beyond just surviving. We're going to build something remarkable here, Lydia said with absolute certainty. I can feel it. As long as we build it together, Gavin said, I don't care what challenges we face. We'll handle them. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie and the stars blazed in the clear winter sky. Inside, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds held tight to the future they'd chosen together. The legal battle with Jake Mooney still loomed ahead. Winter would test them with its harshness. The ranch would demand everything they had and more. But for tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight they were simply Gavin and Lydia Rourke, beginning the greatest adventure of their lives with nothing but love and determination to guide them. And somehow, that felt like more than enough. The honeymoon period, such as it was, lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th morning after the wedding, Lydia woke to find Gavin already dressed and standing at the window, his posture rigid with tension. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting up. "Smoke," he said, coming from the direction of the Archer property. Lydia was out of bed in seconds, joining him at the window. Sure enough, a thin column of black smoke rose from the west, stark against the pale winter sky. "Could be anything," she said, though her stomach was already knotting with dread. "A lightning strike? Someone burning brush? There hasn't been lightning in weeks, and nobody's supposed to be on that land." Gavin was already moving toward the door. "I'm riding out to check. You stay here with Webb." "No," Lydia said firmly. "If this is Mooney making a move, I'm coming with you." "Lydia, we're partners, remember? That means I don't sit safely at home while you ride into potential danger." She was already pulling on her riding clothes, the practical split skirt and sturdy boots she'd acquired for ranch work. "Besides, you'll need an extra pair of eyes." Gavin looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded curtly. "Then hurry, and bring the rifle I gave you." They rode hard toward the smoke, with Webb following close behind. Tom stayed at the ranch to watch over the property and the livestock. The morning was bitterly cold, the horse's breath forming clouds in the frozen air, but Lydia barely felt it. Her entire focus was on that column of smoke growing larger as they approached. What they found made Gavin's face go white with rage. The small cabin that had stood on the Archer property, the house where Samuel Archer had lived and died, was engulfed in flames. The fire had clearly been set deliberately, with accelerant judging by how intensely it burned despite the cold and the snow. And standing near the tree line, watching the destruction, was a group of 5 men on horseback. Jake Mooney sat his horse in the center, his expression smug with satisfaction. Gavin pulled his horse to a stop 50 yards from the burning cabin, his hand moving to the rifle on his saddle. Lydia and Webb flanked him, forming a united front. "Mooney!" Gavin's voice carried across the snow. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Just clearing some old timber off land that's rightfully mine," Mooney called back. "No law against burning down structures on your own property." "This isn't your property. The auction was legal, and you know it." "The court hasn't ruled yet, Rourke. Until they do, this land's in dispute, which means anything I do here is justified as protecting my interests." Mooney's smile was cold and calculating. "Besides, that cabin was a fire hazard. I did the county a favor." "You're destroying evidence," Webb said, his voice rough with anger. "That cabin was where Sam Archer died. Could have had proof in there about what really happened." Mooney's eyes narrowed. "You accusing me of something, old man?" "I'm stating facts," Webb replied. "Everyone knows you killed Sam Archer over water rights. Now you're trying to wipe out any trace of him." The men flanking Mooney shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. The tension ratcheted up instantly, the moment balanced on a knife's edge between confrontation and violence. Lydia felt her heart hammering, but kept her voice steady. There are 3 of us and 5 of you, but we're on higher ground, and my husband is the best shot in the territory. If you're thinking about starting something here, Mr. Mooney, I suggest you reconsider. Mooney's gaze shifted to her, surprise and something like grudging respect flickering across his features. The little bride speaks. Sam Archer's replacement has some backbone, after all. I'm not anyone's replacement, Lydia said coldly. I'm Lydia Rourke, and this is my land you're burning, my family you're threatening, and I promise you, we don't scare easily. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Mooney laughed, though there was no humor in it. You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit won't win in court, and it won't keep you warm when winter really sets in and you're buried in legal fees. He gathered his reins. Enjoy your little ranch while you can, Rourke. By spring, it'll all be mine. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following, but the threat hung in the air like the smoke from the burning cabin, dark and poisonous. They stayed and watched the cabin burn, making sure the fire didn't spread to the grassland around it. There was nothing worth saving. The structure was old and had been empty for months. But watching it collapse into ash and charred timber felt like watching the last traces of Samuel Archer disappear. He's escalating, Webb said quietly. Burning the cabin was a message. Next time it might be the barn or the main house. I know, Gavin said, his jaw tight. We need to file a complaint with the sheriff, get this on record. Sheriff's in Mooney's pocket, Webb pointed out. Everyone knows it. Then we go over his head, right to the territorial marshal, the land office in Denver, anyone who'll listen. Gavin looked at Lydia. This is going to get worse before it gets better. I know, she said, but we don't back down. That evening, Lydia sat at the kitchen table composing letters while Gavin worked through the ranch ledgers. She wrote to the territorial marshal detailing the fire and Mooney's implicit threats. She wrote to the land office explaining the situation and requesting expedited resolution of the legal challenge. She even wrote to a newspaper editor in Denver, laying out the facts of Sam Archer's death and the subsequent attempts to steal his land. You think anyone will care? Gavin asked, watching her seal the letters. I think people care about injustice when it's presented clearly enough, Lydia said. And I think Jake Mooney has probably made enough enemies that someone will be willing to help us fight him. She was right, though it took weeks for the responses to come. Winter deepened, and with it came the kind of cold that made even breathing painful. They worked from dawn until dark, caring for livestock that struggled in the harsh conditions, breaking ice from water sources, and rationing feed that had to last until spring. The legal proceedings dragged on, each hearing resulting in postponements and continuances that ate up time and money they could barely spare. But something unexpected began to happen. Other ranchers, ones who'd also suffered under Mooney's aggressive expansion tactics, started reaching out. First it was just quiet words of support when Gavin went to town for supplies. Then it became more concrete, offers to testify about Mooney's methods, documentation of similar harassment, even financial contributions toward legal fees. Turns out we're not alone in this fight, Webb observed one evening as Gavin tallied up the support they'd received. Half the ranchers in the county have grievances against Mooney. They're just waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to him. Or foolish enough, Gavin said, but there was a note of hope in his voice. The breakthrough came in late January when Edgar Pritchard arrived at the ranch with news that changed everything. The territorial marshal's office investigated the fire, he said, stamping snow from his boots as he entered the warm kitchen. They found evidence that accelerant was used, and they have testimony from one of Mooney's hands who was willing to talk. The man says Mooney ordered the cabin burned specifically to destroy any evidence related to Sam Archer's death. Lydia set down the bread she was kneading. Will they prosecute? Better than that, the marshal's office is reopening the investigation into Sam's death. The hand who talked says there's another witness who saw what really happened at Crane Creek, a drifter who was camping nearby. They're tracking him down now. Gavin leaned forward. If they can prove Mooney murdered Sam, then the legal challenge to the property sale becomes moot, Pritchard finished. You can't inherit or purchase land from someone you murdered. It's called Slayer statute. The property would go to Sam's cousin in Kansas, who's already on record saying he wants you to have it. For the first time in months, Lydia felt genuine hope. When will they know? Could be weeks, could be days, But the marshal's taking it seriously, which is more than we had before. Pritchard accepted the coffee Lydia offered him. In the meantime, Mooney's lawyers are getting nervous. They've started making settlement offers again, higher than before. Tell them no, Gavin said immediately. We're seeing this through. After Pritchard left, Lydia and Gavin stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over snow-covered mountains. It's not over yet, Gavin said. No, Lydia agreed, but it feels like we're finally fighting back instead of just defending. He pulled her close. I couldn't do this without you. The letters you wrote, the way you've organized the documentation, even just being here to remind me why this matters. None of this would be possible without you. We're partners, Lydia said simply. That's what partners do. The waiting was agonizing. Every day they expected news, and every day brought nothing but the usual challenges of winter ranching. Lydia threw herself into work, expanding her teaching plans for the school she still hoped to build, helping Gavin plan improvements for the combined properties once the legal issues were resolved, and writing more letters to anyone who might influence the outcome. She also discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually. The morning nausea she'd initially attributed to stress, the exhaustion that went beyond normal tiredness, the way certain smells suddenly made her ill. When she finally allowed herself to acknowledge what her body was telling her, the mixture of joy and terror was overwhelming. She told Gavin that night after supper when they were alone by the fire. I'm with child, she said simply. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, wonder dawned across his features. You're certain? As certain as I can be. I'd say I'm about 2 months along. The baby would come in late summer. Gavin crossed to her and knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers. How do you feel about it? It was such a Gavin question. No assumptions, no expectations, just a genuine inquiry about her feelings. Terrified, Lydia admitted, and happy, and worried about the timing with everything else happening, but mostly happy. I'm happy too, Gavin said, his voice rough with emotion. Scared out of my mind, but happy. He paused. This changes things. If Mooney knows you're pregnant, he might see it as leverage. Then we don't tell anyone yet, Lydia said. Not until the legal situation is resolved. Just us and Webb. We'll need his help managing things as I get further along. Agreed. Gavin pressed his forehead to hers. A baby. We're going to have a baby. We're going to have a family, Lydia corrected, on land that's ours, in a house we've built together. That's worth fighting for. The news from the marshal's office came in early February, delivered by a federal deputy who rode through a snowstorm to reach them. They'd found the witness, a prospector named Charlie Webb, who'd been camped near Crane Creek the day Sam Archer died. He'd seen the whole confrontation and was willing to testify that Jake Mooney had drawn first, that Sam Archer had been trying to defuse the situation when Mooney shot him in cold blood. It's murder, the deputy said. Clear as day. The marshal's issuing an arrest warrant today. Gavin's expression was grim satisfaction. What about the property dispute? That'll be dismissed once the criminal charges are filed. Like I said, you can't profit from a murder. The land stays with you, assuming the family's wishes are honored. That should have been the end of it, but Jake Mooney wasn't the kind of man who went quietly. The attack came 3 nights later, in the darkest hours before dawn. Lydia woke to the smell of smoke and Gavin shouting her name. She stumbled out of bed to find the barn engulfed in flames, the fire spreading faster than seemed possible. Get dressed and get out, Gavin yelled, already pulling on his boots. Webb's getting the horses out, but we need water. Lydia dressed in seconds, her hands shaking as she laced her boots. Through the window, she could see shadowy figures on horseback at the edge of the firelight, watching. Mooney's men, making sure the job was done. But they'd underestimated the Rourkes. Webb and Tom were already fighting the fire, forming a bucket brigade from the well. Gavin joined them while Lydia ran to help, her pregnant belly barely showing beneath her coat. They worked frantically, desperately, knowing that if the fire reached the hay stores or the main house, everything would be lost. The horses were screaming in terror. Webb had managed to get most of them out, but several were still trapped in the back stalls. Without thinking, Lydia ran toward the burning barn. Lydia, no! Gavin's shout echoed behind her, but she was already inside. Her sleeve pressed over her nose and mouth against the smoke. The heat was overwhelming, and the crackling of flames filled her ears. She found 3 horses in the back, wild-eyed with panic. Using every technique Gavin had taught her over the months, she managed to get halters on 2 of them and led them toward the door. The third one, a young mare, was too terrified to move. Lydia could hear the barn structure groaning, could feel the heat intensifying as the fire spread. She had seconds at most. She grabbed the mare's mane and pulled with all her strength, slapping her flank and shouting until finally, the animal bolted toward the exit. Lydia ran after her, emerging from the barn just as a major support beam collapsed behind her. She stumbled and fell in the snow, gasping for air, her lungs burning. Gavin was there instantly, pulling her away from the burning structure, his face white with terror and fury. "What were you thinking? You could have died. The horses were dying," Lydia coughed. "I couldn't just let them burn." "You're more important than any horse," Gavin said fiercely, checking her over for injuries. "Don't you ever scare me like that again." But there was no time for argument. The fire was still spreading, and they had work to do. For the next 2 hours, they fought the blaze with everything they had. By the time the flames were finally under control, the barn was a total loss, but the house and the other outbuildings had been saved. As dawn broke over the exhausted group, they saw riders approaching. For a moment, Lydia tensed, thinking Mooney had returned to finish the job. But these were different riders, the territorial marshal and 6 deputies, with Jake Mooney in handcuffs between them. The marshal dismounted and surveyed the damage. "We arrested Mooney at his ranch 2 hours ago. Found evidence he was planning this, maps of your property, notes about the best targets. His foreman turned on him, gave us everything we needed." "He tried to kill us," Lydia said, her voice hoarse from smoke. "He'll pay for it," the marshal promised. "Arson, attempted murder, and we've got him dead to rights on Sam Archer's murder. Jake Mooney's not going to see freedom again for a very long time." Mooney was glaring at them from his horse, his face twisted with hatred. "This isn't over, Rourke. I've got lawyers." "Your lawyers can't save you from a federal murder charge," the marshal interrupted. "And your money won't buy your way out of this. You're done." They took Mooney away as the sun rose fully over the horizon, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of gold and pink. Lydia stood with Gavin's arm around her, Webb and Tom flanking them, all of them exhausted and smoke-stained but victorious. "It's really over," Lydia said, almost unable to believe it. "It's over," Gavin confirmed. "The land is ours. The threat is gone. We can finally start building the future we've been planning." The rebuilding took months. The barn had to be completely reconstructed, and they used the opportunity to make it bigger and better than before. Other ranchers, grateful that someone had finally stood up to Mooney, contributed materials and labor. The community came together in a way that reminded Lydia why she'd fallen in love with this hard land and its tough, resilient people. By spring, the new barn stood tall and solid, and the legal issues were completely resolved. The Archer property was officially theirs, doubling the size of Rourke Valley and securing their water rights for generations to come. Edgar Pritchard arrived in April with the final piece of good news. Lydia's claim had been settled. The court had awarded her compensation for being stranded under false pretenses, enough to cover the cost of the barn reconstruction with money left over. "Seems like everything's working out for you folks," Pritchard observed, accepting coffee in the rebuilt kitchen. "We've been lucky," Gavin said. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Pritchard corrected. "You fought for what was right, and you didn't back down when things got hard. That's not luck. That's character." As spring turned to summer, Lydia's pregnancy became obvious. She continued working as much as she could, but Gavin and Webb insisted she take on lighter tasks. She used the time to finalize plans for the school she'd been dreaming about. The schoolhouse was built in June, a sturdy one-room structure on the Archer property with windows that let in plenty of light and a wood stove for heat. The neighboring ranchers contributed funds and materials, and their children would be the school's first students when it opened in the fall. "It's perfect," Margaret said when she came out from Red Hollow to see it. "Sam Archer would have loved this, building something that helps the whole community." "That's what Gavin and I want," Lydia said, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "Not just a ranch, but a real community, a place where families can thrive." The baby came in late August, on a warm evening when the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The labor was long and difficult. with only the local midwife and Margaret in attendance. Gavin paced the porch while Webb tried unsuccessfully to distract him with ranch business. When the baby's first cry finally split the evening air, Gavin burst through the door to find Lydia exhausted but beaming, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. "A daughter," the midwife announced. "Strong and healthy." Gavin approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his daughter's red, scrunched face. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "She's perfect," Lydia agreed. "What should we name her?" They discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at their daughter, the answer seemed obvious. "Eliza," Gavin said, "for new beginnings." "Eliza Rourke," Lydia tested the name. "Yes, that's exactly right." The years that followed were marked by growth and prosperity. The ranch expanded steadily, the cattle herd grew, and the school flourished with Lydia teaching when she could and hiring other teachers as the student population increased. Other families moved to the area, drawn by the promise of good land and a strong community. Jake Mooney was convicted of murder and arson and sentenced to life in prison. His ranch was sold to cover his legal debts, the land divided among several smaller ranchers who worked it cooperatively. The water disputes that had plagued the region for years were resolved through fair negotiation rather than violence. Webb stayed on as foreman, becoming like a grandfather to Eliza, and eventually to the two more children who followed, a son named Samuel, after the man whose death had inadvertently brought Lydia and Gavin together, and another daughter named Grace. By the time Eliza was 5 years old, Rourke Valley had become one of the most successful ranches in Colorado. The original house had been expanded to accommodate the growing family, and a second house had been built for the ranch foreman and his family. The school served 30 children from surrounding properties, and there was talk of building a proper town nearby. One evening in early fall, Lydia and Gavin stood on the ridge overlooking everything they'd built. Eliza played at their feet, building elaborate structures with small stones and prairie grass. In the distance, they could see the schoolhouse, the expanded barn, the grazing cattle, and the fertile land that stretched as far as the eye could see. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Gavin asked, "when you arrived to find Sam dead and your whole future collapsed?" "Sometimes," Lydia admitted, "but not with regret. Never with regret." "Even though you lost so much? Had to start over from nothing?" Lydia turned to face him, this man who'd given her everything: love, partnership, purpose, and a life beyond anything she could have imagined. "I didn't lose anything that mattered, and I didn't start from nothing. I started from hope and determination and a willingness to build something new." She looked out over the valley again, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "I came here to marry a man I'd never met, planning to build a life based on practical arrangements and mutual survival. Instead, I found a partner who sees me as an equal. I found work that challenges and fulfills me. I found a community that values contribution over convention. I found home." Gavin pulled her close, his arm around her waist. "I found all that too. I just didn't know I was looking for it until you stepped off that train." Eliza looked up from her play. "Tell me the story again, Mama, about how you came here on the train." It had become her favorite tale, the story of how her mother had traveled across the country to marry a stranger and ended up with a completely different life. Lydia settled onto the grass and pulled her daughter into her lap. "Well, it started with a very long train ride and ended with the greatest adventure of my life." "Tell it from the beginning," Eliza insisted. "The very beginning was in Philadelphia," Lydia said, "where I was someone completely different, someone smaller and scared, who didn't know yet how strong she could be." "But you got strong here," Eliza said confidently, "because of the ranch and Papa and the hard work." "That's right, and because I chose to stay when I could have run. I chose to fight when I could have given up. I chose love when I could have settled for safety." Gavin sat down beside them, and they watched together as the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in colors that seemed impossible and perfect. The prairie stretched before them, vast and unforgiving and beautiful, holding the future they'd built together. "Was it worth it?" Eliza asked. "All the hard parts?" Lydia looked at her daughter, then at Gavin, then out at the land they'd fought for and won. She thought about the girl she'd been on that train platform, desperate and alone, and the woman she'd become, strong, capable, loved, and exactly where she belonged. Every single moment, she said, every challenge, every fear, every risk, it was all worth it to get here, to this exact moment, with this exact life. Because you were brave, Eliza said. Because I learned to be brave, Lydia corrected. There's a difference. Courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose again and again, especially when choosing it is hard. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they made their way back down to the house where light glowed warm in the windows and the smell of supper drifted on the evening breeze. This was home. Not the place Lydia had expected when she stepped off that train 5 years ago, but the place she'd built through determination, love, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. She'd arrived in Red Hollow too late to meet the man she'd come to marry, but she'd arrived exactly on time to find the life she was meant to live, the man she was meant to love, and the future she was meant to build. And on that vast Colorado prairie, under skies that stretched forever, the Rourke family had planted roots that would last for generations. Their story of courage and partnership, of choosing love over fear, of building something lasting from the ashes of disappointment, became legend in the territory. Because sometimes the train arrives late. Sometimes plans collapse and futures disappear. Sometimes you find yourself stranded in an unfamiliar place with nothing but your own strength to rely on. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to stay, you discover that being late for one destiny puts you exactly on time for another. Lydia Hartwell had come west to marry a stranger. Instead, she became Lydia Rourke, builder of communities, partner to a man who valued her strength, mother to children who would inherit not just land, but the legacy of courage their parents had forged together. She'd arrived too late for the life she'd planned, but she'd arrived precisely when she needed to, exactly where she belonged, ready to build something far greater than she'd ever imagined. And that made all the difference.